Okay. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Council Planning Committee work session on affordable housing. I think with me on the committee is Dan Hamill, April Barker. We have Rick Seppler. We have Chris Behe. We have Mr. Steve Clark from Bellingham Public Schools and Mr. Peter Raffato. So I think you want to begin with Mr. Clark?
Well, I could just give
Sure,
a little.
go ahead.
So, Steve, I served on the boundary committee, the redrawing the boundary lines for the school district, and although this is an affordable housing conversation, it was very interesting to me that throughout that process, we started finding out that the reason why you were even trying to do some boundary changes was due to some development to the north that was overcrowding a school. And then, of course, within that boundary conversation, we started having more conversations. If we were going to redraw the lines, what should we be looking at? So I thought it would be really beneficial for us to understand the housing market and how it impacts the schools. And then, of course, just for the community, this is also an opportunity to inform them of what's going on within the public schools and the drawing of lines over a period of time. Does that help? Yes.
Okay, sure. So, yeah, April, I appreciate that. So we have been, over the past few years, taking a look at our enrollment projections. Chris has been really helpful with us seeing the growth patterns that are happening in the city and then experiencing it firsthand this year, where we actually had one of our schools where we were worried we weren't going to be able to accommodate the kids that lived in that service area. That's primarily Cordata Elementary School. So we watched the growth in the sort of the June Meadows area, June Road, Bakerview, Via Santa Fe, the big housing developments that have gone in out there, and the size that we built Cordata for really was not taken in, we didn't take into consideration. I think that we were going to have all this growth happening on the north end out there. So what's happened is, as those have been built and kids have moved in, our classes have gotten bigger and our schools have gotten bigger on the north end, and we have have hit a bit of a panic spot. Fortunately, we were able to accommodate the kids this year, and we have some changes, which is what you were a part of, to our boundaries that would better accommodate the kids in those north end areas so that they wouldn't be in overcrowded schools. So what we did is we took a look at the north end. We took a look at Alderwood's boundaries, Cordata's boundaries, Sunnyland boundaries, Parkview's boundaries, Northern Heights boundaries, everything up on the north end. We looked at it and said, what do we need to do out here to see if we could both find room in the other schools for the kids that were growing in the north end to accommodate them, and to see if we could find some diversity by maybe changing the boundaries so we have more diverse schools rather than concentrated pockets all in one school of students in higher poverty, ethnic backgrounds. We believe that diverse schools are good for all kids, and we had an opportunity to do something about that when we saw the growth on the north end. So we changed the elementary boundary, and we were also changing the high school boundary because we knew Squalicum was part of that growth, as is Shuckson part of that growth. So we were also looking at changing Squalicum's boundary, moving some students down into Bellingham High, so changing that northern Bellingham boundary and the southern Squalicum boundary to see if we could bring 100 or so students down into Bellingham and do the same thing. See if we could create a little more diversity within the Bellingham High School boundary that is rich in the north boundary of Squalicum. So we changed that boundary, as well as changing Cordata's boundaries to accommodate the numbers and to accommodate and try and address some diversity issues.
Yeah.
Sure, go ahead.
Well, one, I think it would be helpful, Chris, if you were really critical in showing us all the growth that was happening to the north. And I think some people that might not go out that way are not quite aware of the boom that's happening. I think that would be really helpful if we have that information. But also, I know that we were able to accommodate that 100 kids out of Cordata, but my understanding is already we're going to see Cordata back full again and need to look at that one more time on the population front. Is that correct?
I think so.
Okay.
we were taking a look to see what would happen with that June Meadows large development that's out there, and that's been a slow infill. It feels like that's not they're not filling up as fast as we anticipated, so we've been able to accommodate so far. But if that, I forget how many units are in there.
Just under
340 units in that, and the fence line separates that complex from Cordata Elementary. They are literally in their backyard. So once that fills up, and once we project a number of students go into that development that we think are going to go into that development, we're going to be at the same. We're going to be at it again with Cordata. So we're going to continue to look at the boundaries and figure out what we do. When, kind of hand in glove, we've been doing our facilities task force at the same time as we're doing the attendance boundary adjustment. So we're adjusted a temporary boundary adjustment now, and at the same time, we're going to be coming out in February. We anticipate a bond going potentially before the voters to take a look at potentially redoing and remodeling some of our schools in the city to provide greater capacity to be able to accommodate the further growth that's happening on the north end.
Steve, does that also mess with the bus system when you have to relocate and move people around? That probably changes that end of it,
It does
too.
a little bit, yeah. We're moving. By moving the boundaries a little bit, we're forced to kind of change our bus routes a little bit, and we've been able to do that. Fortunately, we did pass a bus levy, a special levy, so we have a transportation levy. Oh, hello, it's the mayor.
All rise.
Watch what I say.
All rise.
All right.
So I think there are some transportation issues, but we've been able to address those. We do have we made one temporary move that we didn't. It was a good move, I think, but it's via Santa Fe, which is a migrant housing development on Bakerview. We did temporarily move those students to Alderwood for the remainder of the year. As they moved into that housing development, we want them to attend their neighborhood school, which is Cordata, but we weren't able to allow those students to attend there. We just didn't have the room. So we were sending them on a bus over to Alderwood. They finished the year out there, and next year they'll be going to Cordata. So we did have to do some things with transportation, but we think we're going to be okay with that.
Yeah.
Do we have a handle on projections in terms of North End growth for the next 4 or 5 years in terms of how many families are we looking at, and what's the impact for schools?
Yeah, we have a lot of good information on that, mainly from Chris Behe. Chris, you want to speak to that?
Yeah, and I can show some of that in just a few minutes when we want to transition to show some slides. Yeah, like Steve said, I mean, part of the first phase of the district, the boundary adjustment process that we went through, that the committee met the first half of the year on, was dealing with that short-term growth and again making that adjustment for the north side, kind of reshuffling the elementary boundaries, and then for Bellingham and Squalicum, the two high school boundaries. The numbers, again, it depends on how quickly the housing projects get completed and how quickly or what the student generation rates are in those. And some of the growth that I'll show you in a few minutes on the maps is not housing that generates students. We've got like if you're probably familiar with the Affinity Senior Housing Project out off of Telegraph, and there are some things that are specifically they don't generate students for that reason, or they're studio apartments or something like that, where they're not typically what we think of as family housing. But for the projects that are either subsidized or market rate and larger apartment multifamily units, those do generate families with students, or they accommodate families with students, and then also the single family is the largest generator for students. On average, they have, I think district-wide, it's around 0.3 students per unit is what we see with those, and then with a standard multifamily unit, it's closer to 1/10 of a student per multifamily unit, but if it's a subsidized housing unit, it's closer to the single-family rate of about 1/3 of a student per unit on average. Some of them, like the Via Santa Fe ones, have a much higher rate of families occupying them, and so they were closer to like 0.5 students, or even closer to 1 in some cases per unit. So again, it just kind of depends on the style of housing and who ends up moving in there. Overall, the numbers that the district is looking at, and they have a demographer that also verified, kind of cross-checked all the housing information that we had generated and what we think that might accommodate in students. I think the recent adjustments that were made bought some time, but that they are going to be needing to look at that, not just on the north side, but citywide, because I think Steve can probably speak to it more, but the overall long-term strategy is not just adjusting some of those boundaries on the north side, but probably adjusting all of the boundaries citywide to add add that capacity on the north side. So if you can think of just a series of dominoes and shuffling that capacity farther north, and then also the new levee that would be coming forward at some point would increase capacity in the north side schools that would be rebuilt. I can't remember how many students per building, but a significant number per building, so that would also add capacity.
Yeah, maybe as we think about there's a housing development that hasn't started yet out behind Costco out there. We know there are 330, I think, single-family homes, as well as, I think, some multifamily units out there. And we know that if that happens in the next 3 to 5 years, we need to be ahead of that. Cordata, again, that's a Cordata Alderwood area. We can't accommodate it, especially with Cordata. So if you go into the minutes of our facilities planning task force, our schools that we're targeting in terms of rebuilding is really to develop and remodel our existing schools to be able to accommodate and infill rather than build a new school out on the north end of town. We really think by increasing the size of Parkview, by increasing the size of Alderwood, increasing the size of Sunnyland, that we would be able to absorb some of that. But that may mean also, adjusting our boundaries to the south of those schools to also make some accommodations. So if things happen right, we'll be okay. It's really hard to predict, but we think our plan for rebuilding our next set of schools aligns with where the growth is happening on the north end, and it gives us a chance to, again, bring some diversity to those schools. And by changing a few boundaries, we think we're going to accomplish a lot of things. Actually, it's not a bad thing. It could be a good thing for our schools.
Chris, do you have King Mountain looks to be 1,400 units in 20 years? Has that also been factored into your numbers?
It is, yeah. I don't know if at one point you want me to jump to the slides. I think we're kind of talking around a lot of stuff, and I answer some questions. So.
If you don't mind. While Chris is getting that all set up, eventually, and it might segue quite nicely through some of these slides, but we could go into talking about the school district gave I think 8 criteria that the boundary committee got to choose from to say what are our priorities going to be, not just to get the volume out of a school just so it can be productive and have the programs that it needs, but also if we're going to be changing these boundaries and we don't want to keep changing them over time, what are other things we might want to look at? And so I think that would be something that we could address if it comes up in this or otherwise afterwards.
That would be great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
There's a lot of information here. I'm just going to go through these fairly quickly, and then if you guys have questions, we can pull up additional information or go back to things. So. This is just the current snapshot of our population growth. We just got the final OFM numbers for April 1st. This past month we received these, and you can see we had the largest jump. We grew 1,870 people from the previous April, which over the past 5 years we've averaged about just over 1,000 people per year. So you can see we are seeing the increased housing production, again, still in that kind of recovery mode from the recession, but we are seeing the occupancy of those units have an impact on our population. Again, just background, the council members who've been through the comp plan update are familiar with this, but about 3/4 of our growth every year is in migration, so more people moving here than moving away, and the remaining 25% is our actual birth rate increase, about 1,350 people per year. And just a reminder that our housing occupancy citywide, that about 70% of our households are 1 to 2 person households. And then just existing housing types, we're primarily single and larger multifamily, and then we have a fair number of mixed-use multifamily projects in our urban villages. We're split right now about 56% single-family style housing and about 44% multifamily. And again, what our comp plan is aiming for is accommodating a lot of that new growth through different types of infill, which with a broader spectrum of kind of that middle range, kind of blending things that look kind of like single family or multifamily. Just our citywide zoning map. So this shows where we're currently accommodating people based on housing style. So the size of the dot corresponds to how many people are living at this particular location. The yellow areas or yellow dots are single family style housing, and the orange ones are the multifamily. And again, just kind of most of you are familiar with the pattern of the single family neighborhoods. and then where we have concentrations of multifamily, a lot of that happening in the north here in the Cordata area, the Maplewood corridor, and just beyond the city in the Alderwood area, and then of course the Roosevelt neighborhood and Barclay areas, and then our downtown and Happy Valley areas and Fairhaven have large concentrations again of multifamily housing. Just as another way to look at this, this is our rental registration and safety inspection program. This is all registered units in the city, and again, the size of the dot corresponds to how many units are registered at that location. And again, you can see they're all over the city. This is our percent by neighborhood, the percentage of overall housing in each neighborhood that's in the rental registration program, and you can see again the pattern of the student housing around Western. Our downtown area has a very high percentage of rental housing, Roosevelt, and then you can see again fairly high percentages around the north side as well. These are the rental registration units where we filtered out everything but single family. So these are just single family rentals around the city, and you can see again a lot of student housing, but also throughout neighborhoods where we know there aren't a lot of students living. They're just areas with a lot of rental housing. This is a snapshot of our different housing types. You can see of the 40-some thousand units we have in the city.
Sorry.
Okay.
I'll joke down. Very meaningful presentation. Some of my order. You could have some of mine, but
I'll try to be quiet.
No, you're okay. So of all the housing in the city, you could see that we have again that 50-some percent, 18,000, some of the 36,000, some total are single family. We have around just over 3,000 of those are rentals, and then you can see that as we go up through the larger unit, larger complexes or units per property. You can see the distribution there. A lot of our, the blue bars are the rental registration numbers in each of those categories. When we get into the larger categories, you see fewer registered rentals relative to the total numbers, and a lot of that's because those are subsidized and they're already inspected in other programs, and so they're not subject to rental registration. And some of them are condominiums as well. This is our developable land map from the comp plan, and this is getting at what the school district is dealing with. You can see in addition to our urban village areas, the blue areas there, and our institutional campuses, you can see by and large the lion's share of our developable land is on the north side. Those are the more recent neighborhoods that we've annexed to the city. You can see these large tracts of vacant land. Some of them, this is the area just north of Costco. Steve was just referring to there's a large subdivision out there with 440 units, I think, total in it, about 300 and some of which are single family. That's going through the plat process right now. The King Mountain neighborhood that Gene was alluding to, this whole area was annexed in 2009 to the city, and has a very large number of projected units in it. And as you'll see on the map I'll show in just a second, is experiencing rapid growth right now.
I have a question for Chris. So on the right-hand side where it says UGA, and it's the purple right there, is that served by Wade King? What?
Down here?
Right there, yeah.
Yeah, this is the U Street urban growth area. So the Wade King attendance area covers this area, and then also extends down around Lake Samish, I believe. It goes down all the way to the county border down there.
So what's your capacity at Wade King?
450, I think, somewhere in there. And Wade King, we're actually okay right now in Wade King. We have a little bit of room in there, but it's a big school.
Mm-hmm. I was just wondering.
Yeah. How many developable lots do we have left in the city?
I don't have the actual number of lots in my head right now. We have capacity in the city for and the growth area total for around just over 5,000 single-family lots. We have preliminary plats and existing plats for a little over 600 of those that are like, you could go out and get a building permit today for those. And then the urban growth area has about 10% overall over our overall growth capacity. And so there's just a little over, I believe it's a little over 1,400 total developable, when you take away environmental constraints and all the other infrastructure pieces, capacity for about 1,400 additional housing units out there that would be single family kinds of development. Some of them could be multifamily if they're in the what are now the URMX zones. This is our housing production by year. The graph at the top here is total housing inventory in the city, and you can see the single family on the bottom, multifamily on the top, and then duplex, triplex, and fourplex in the middle, the different bands there. And so the just overall shift per year, you can see gradually increasing percentages. And then this is our new housing production. So this has got your existing inventory and your new, and this is just looking at what have we actually built year over year in the last 10 years. And you can see the effects of the recession here and us climbing out of the recession. This is April 1st, 2016 to April of 2017. And you can see that we built about 488 multifamily in the 5 and over category, 7 triplex, fourplex units, 30 duplexes, and about 181 single family units, which you can see based on the patterns here. The numbers were higher than previous years, but the distribution of units is pretty consistent. That's kind of what our housing stock is, what we're producing is the percentages don't change drastically year to year. And you can see over the past 3 years, we've averaged, somewhere between 500 and 600 units per year, somewhere in that range. For the past year, I don't have that information.
Go ahead, Rick.
The significant majority is private development. Recall that the whole levy for its duration is looking to get about 700 units. Clearly, with 488 spread over yearly, it's vast majority is private.
I'm trying to think of the projects. So in that 488 unit one, most of those are going to be projects out along Telegraph and a few downtown, and I can't think of any of those that were subsidized in the past year. There will be some coming on next year that will be. So
I forgot to make the announcement earlier. We'll have public comment here in about 15 minutes. So go ahead, Chris.
So this is so you can keep this little bar chart, this part up here in your head, and then this is what that looked like citywide, the distribution on the map. You can see where the single family and multifamily landed. Getting back to what Steve was referring to, you can see this is Cordata Elementary is right here on the map, and this is the large June Road development that units have been completed in the past several years. They started several years ago, and we'll see construction in that development continuing for a few more years. And there is a large apartment component at the north end, and then right on either side of June Road are single-family homes they're condominiums, but they're single-family form construction. And so this is what happened in the past 12 months there, and you'll see on the current and future development map more landing there. This is I think the Santa Fe development that was also completed out there, and then you can see more going in along Telegraph and north on Bakerview. This is just construction completed since this past April, so just the past several months. Again, you can see more construction happening in that June Road area, along Telegraph, some other areas throughout the city. You're seeing more multifamily being completed. And then looking at what's in our current permit pipeline, we have about 1,400 housing units, what we would call in the pipeline. As of July 18th, just over 1,000 in the multifamily category, 8 fourplexes, 6 triplexes, 44 duplexes, and 260 some single families. In addition, in pre-application, there's activity or interest in about 1,500 additional units. Again, this is just as of last week. with about just over 1,000 of those being multifamily housing forms and about 540 being single-family. Almost 360 of those units would be what we would call infill toolkit units. And some of those, as you're familiar with, some of those could be townhomes, some of them could be cottage style. They take a variety of different forms. But
Dan, go ahead.
Chris, just to clarify, I want to get the numbers straight here. So the permits for 1,401, those are in the pipeline. So those are in the process of being developed. And then the pre-application, the 1,551, are those two separate numbers?
those are above and beyond that 1,400. So those are people that have come in for, some of them are fairly solid. You know, people come in with a plan. They're pretty much ready to go, but they haven't submitted their permits yet. They haven't applied yet. And some of them are more speculative, just, is this possible for me to do this kind of thing? So it's a whole range of property owners expressing interest, coming in for a pre-app meeting. But again, 1,550 some units in that category, people expressing interest in moving forward with a project or in the kind of exploratory phase.
So 2,900 potential units coming our way within the next year?
Yeah, let me get to the timeline here, and I'll kind of make an attempt at...
And Rick, do they use the infill, I see the infill toolkit 359, do they actually ask about that when they come in?
Yes, it's,
They are, so it's, because I remember when we had 0, so I'm kind of amazed.
Significant trend is we're seeing more inquiries, though there are limited areas they can go in. People are looking at them because they're meeting a need in the marketplace. And I think the numbers that are in the queue reflect a profound interest in establishing that housing type.
Because there was times when some council members wanted to get rid of the infill toolkit and not talk about it anymore, but obviously it's starting to take off, so, okay.
So these numbers here, I'm going to break out a little bit here. The 1,400 units that are in the pipeline here, we'll go through a couple of slides to show you where those are. So of those, 946 units have been issued but haven't yet been completed. So these are what we would kind of call the under construction category. The permits are out. We're waiting for people to come in and ask for a final inspection of some sort, and they're in the process of getting their framing inspections and all the other things that happen with housing construction. Of those, you can see 725 were in the multifamily category. We had 8 fourplexes and 6 triplexes, 22 duplexes, and 185 single families. And you can see they're kind of distributed throughout the city. But again, lots of growth on the north side and then in our urban village areas as well. Total in that category, there's 13 infill toolkit units in the kind of the issued but not yet completed category. There are 71 housing units, or permits for 71 units that have been approved but not yet issued. Those are just waiting for someone to pay their fees or for some final box to get checked, basically. But those are ones that we would expect would be issued soon. And you can see the numbers there. 9 of those are infill toolkit units. And again, you can see continued activity just incrementally to kind of out there in that area south of Cordata. There are 384 units that have been applied for but not yet approved, so they're winding their way through the approval process. And then also, again, as I said before, 1,551 units that are pre-app units. So those are above and beyond those. And you can see, again, distributed around the city. And so then when we combine our pipeline and pre-app projects, this gets to the number you were looking at, Dan, 2,950 total housing units, just over 2,000 of those being what we would call multifamily housing forms and 800 single-family units. And again, the infill toolkit types of development spread throughout those projects.
Hey, to clarify, Chris, I know in our comprehensive plan, we talk about single-family housing as single-family detached, attached, duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, townhomes. So when you're saying multifamily, are you saying multifamily is including all those forms, or when you say single-family, you're including all those forms in the single-family?
So when we see them on the map here, we've broken it out by type, and then when I look at this 2,150, the multifamily is going to be your duplex and above.
So we're still saying that's multifamily. Okay, that's an interest. We're going to have to start parsing that out. I think,
and
since our
we can
comprehensive
refine
plan
that just
says
for
that
general
they're
purposes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You know the average in the 2,150 multifamily per unit, how many bedrooms?
I don't
You
have
don't
that.
know that.
I haven't drilled for this.
That's not calculated into...
We have that information in the permit system, so we
Okay.
could go back
That's
and
fine.
look at that.
Mayor,
So one of the questions I ask often is about condos downtown. We have them in Fairhaven, and I just heard you mention, I think, that some of the development north in the Cordata area would be condominiums or condominiumized.
Right. So in the June Road development, they have there's the apartment, larger multifamily format, which also has some townhomes in it, some buildings that are segmented into 2 or 3 story townhome style housing. The units going on immediately on either side of June, just north and south of it immediately, they look like single-family homes. They are single-family homes. They have single-family construction. The land instrument that they are located on is a condominium. When the assessor looks at it, they are treated as condominiums. So there is the people own the units, and there is common land ownership in a condominium-style development where there's a homeowners association.
So briefly, and maybe it's Rick that's going to tell me this, or you, Peter. So is it a land use designation that I keep hearing it's a financing issue. So
Yeah.
I'm just wondering why.
There's a statewide issue regarding condominium development that's been thwarting their use, largely because there's a high propensity for litigation with condominiums. Virtually everything that gets built that's condominiumized in Seattle vertical condominiums, ends up in court. And acknowledging that the likelihood of having litigation, most of it dealing with construction-related issues, makes it such a disincentive. The numbers have fallen dramatically. Additionally, as long as we can do fee simple lots, for example, by doing townhomes and breaking them out into lots that can be conveyed, it negates the need to have an association, the ongoing costs, all those things that are there. So there are some changes that are in the wind that will affect how condominiums are structured and their exposure. They've been talked about for a while. If they do move through, we probably see that house form, and it's a form of ownership, not a land use. It's just the way we divide it. Might see it used more frequently. In the cases we're discussing, they're not the vertical ones that tend to have as much risk because the sheathing and the issues associated with construction. Virtually everything they build has mold or deterioration, which is what the litigation typically goes off of on that. And I think they're probably a little less risk averse, and they're willing to, or more
I'm
risk
just
averse.
thinking of people, there's a lot of people my age in the community
Mm-hmm.
who don't want a fee simple house because they don't want to take care of the yard and the painting and the repairs and all that kind of thing. And if we had that alternative for people, or
Mm-hmm.
some kind of alternative for people like me that didn't look like an apartment, that kind of had the house feel, but, you know, 2-story or whatever, then it may free up more single-family homes that people have just outgrown and wouldn't necessarily be in a place where they'd be used for student rentals or other things like that that actually would go into home ownership. So
We can permit condominium development anytime it walks in. It's a matter of the private sector responding, and then some pending statewide legislation changes that would reduce some of the exposure.
So this is getting at kind of trying to ballpark how many years of construction this could be. Looking at again at that recent construction graph that we had, you can see kind of what the last 3 years have looked like. So if we assume we're doing somewhere between 500 and 700 units per year, those 2,950 kind of overall pipeline projects and pre-up units would be about 4 to 6 years worth of construction. And then again, looking at the comp plan and all single and multifamily future housing, we have an average of about 2.1 persons per household that we've estimated or forecast. And so that housing would accommodate somewhere between a little over 1,000 up to about 1,500 people per year. And our comp plan estimated forecast was about 1,350 people per year. So you can see we're kind of right in the middle of where the forecast is kind of right in the middle of what our near-term construction possibilities look like. To just kind of give you an idea. So somewhere in that kind of 4 to 6 year period, and again, like the kind of firsthand knowledge Steve expressed for what Cordata Elementary has been seeing from the June Road development, just being immediately adjacent to the school property, it does take a while for those units to actually be finalized and become occupied. Families move in, and then how many of those families have, like in the case of Cordata, have kids in that, you know, K through 5 age group, or how many are going to Shuckson Middle School or to, you know, Squalicum High School. That's kind of that softer, longer term impact to the school district. But again, it kind of looks like what we've got is around 4 to 6 years of supply currently in the pipeline. And again, that's 1,500 of those are what we would call they're pre-app kinds of projects, and some of those will go through, some of them will go away, and others will take their place. So it's subject to the market and the kind of viability of each of those projects.
One question, not a question, a request. Could you get a copy of this to the rest of the council members? Because this is really good stuff.
Sure.
Thanks.
Yeah.
April.
And the mayor, too.
And the mayor, too. Yeah. Excuse me. Sorry.
Anna.
And the public.
Thank you so much, Chris. That's really valuable. And I think, Steve, this might be where we could segue into why this even came to council. Is we had the boundary committee, and then we took a subgroup of that boundary committee as the committee itself decided the number one objective, besides just trying to balance the populations, is to balance within the population. So this group of 40 plus people said, we want to see a social, economic strata balance in all schools, which we currently don't have. We have some schools with less than 20% free and reduced lunch, and you'll go across the road and you'll have a school with 67% free and reduced lunch. And then within that, the diversity, not just by income, but race also happens. So we broke into this smaller group, and two of the gentlemen, pretty wonky, and they took off, and just really, it was so neat to watch what they tried to discover. But they came back, and in talking with them, they were like, April, this is a city issue, because there's no way we can do it without busing kids, where we could actually integrate these schools, because the neighborhoods are so homogenous around them that ultimately it will take busing, and then should we even be doing that to children? And then that really fascinated me. So I started digging in more of like, where's the infill toolkit allowed, and where's those middle, I mean, we saw that blue stretch where it's kind of the duplexes, it's those upward mobility homes where somebody, right now it's kind of live in a multifamily or go live in a single family, and families are having a hard time balancing what that looks like in between. And so I think when we have these discussions, it's so important to think about our children and where they're growing and what their experiences in their education, and then how we as a city need to be working with you to ensure that your schools are balanced. And I think it comes back to the promise and Dr. Baker saying ultimately he'd love to see nobody shopping a neighborhood, nobody shopping a school, because the schools are so balanced you would be shopping a neighborhood. But ultimately what these gentlemen found out is there's no way you could possibly do it as is right now to balance those schools.
Yeah.
So if you could maybe give some more information on the direction that we're going to try to balance the diversity.
Sure. And it's not a new issue for us, right? As a city, I remember when I taught at Bellingham High for a long time. Go Red Raiders.
Go Red Raiders.
I got a little soul there. And I remember when we had Bellingham and Seaholm, there was a bit of a difficult and tense rivalry for a lot of reasons. I guess having just a two high school town was one, but the demographics made for a difficult rivalry as well. And when we reopened Bellingham High, we closed for 2 years, we built Squalicum, and then we redid the boundaries. And one of the goals in that redistricting of the 3 high schools was to create 10% or less free and reduced lunch range. So at the time, I forget what Seaholm was, maybe 15% free and reduced lunch, and Bellingham High was maybe closer to 35 or 40% free and reduced lunch. And our goal was, let's see if we could change the boundaries so that Squalicum, Bellingham, Seaholm were all within 10 percentage points of each other. And we were able to do that. That was 17 years ago. Well, a lot of things have changed over 17 years, and if you look at the North End, all the growth that's happened on the North End has continued to create that separation now. And when we redid the boundaries for Bellingham, Seaholm, Squalicum, if you remember, all of the lake used to go to Seaholm. As far as that was from Seaholm High School, all of the lake, I mean, most of the waterfront property went to Seaholm. And by redoing the boundaries, we were able to create some really nice, I thought, diversity within all 3 schools by doing that. I think all of the kids, when we reopened Bellingham High and we had Squalicum new and Seaholm, we really felt like we had done something significant for our community by providing that diversity. Well, again, 17 years later, all the growth on the North End, we found that the affordable housing has gone out north, and we have a lot of multifamily homes up north, and really the diversity is a lot of it is on the north end of town. And I really believe, having seen what we had at Bellingham High 17 years ago when we reopened, and to see what's happened in the district by separating neighborhoods and families out and not having as much diversity, I think the students in those schools that don't experience the diversity the way, say, Squalicum or Shuckson or Alderwood are able to experience it. I think the kids in schools like Bellingham High or Columbia Elementary or sometimes a Silver Beach or places like that, you just don't experience the richness of the diversity that you would. For example, my kids went to Roosevelt Elementary, and Roosevelt's about 50% free and reduced lunch. It draws from a number of different neighborhoods, but the richness within Roosevelt's service area was, I was just talking to my wife about it the other day, the experience my kids got by growing up with students that are so different and yet so similar in some ways was powerful for my kids. And I feel, to be honest, I feel sad for some of the kids in some of our schools that just don't have that richness of diversity by not being able to be with kids that are similar or different from them. I just think so. As a school district, we're looking at changing the boundaries, and right now we have a north, central, southern. Maybe it makes sense to go, east, west, central. We don't know, but we're committed to providing diverse schools and diverse opportunities for kids, and we think we know it's a very sensitive and touchy subject. We're very careful about that. But we see a situation like Parkview Elementary, for example. Parkview is a great little neighborhood school. We could grow that school a little bit. We could get it a little bit bigger. We can bring boundaries. We can change boundaries a little bit and bring maybe a little more diversity. Same with Columbia or in Alderwood. We change Alderwood's boundary a little bit, and we pick up the single-family homes that are being built behind Cordata. You have a way of bringing diversity, but anything you can do to help us would be appreciated, because, as you know, there are certain neighborhoods where it is what it is. In order to bring in diversity, we've got to be able to provide maybe some different housing within those neighborhoods to be able to get that diversity into our schools, or we're just going to have to continue to figure out how to change our boundaries, which sometimes is a wonky process. And
it'll just keep.
Rick,
we'll just keep doing it.
You had your hand, and then April, you go ahead.
And just a precursor, on pre-applications, this is the disclaimer in the fine print at the bottom of the presentation. Pre-applications are not projects in the bank and shouldn't be construed as absolute numbers. And in a sense, we often discount them heavily when we factor them into figuring out how we will perfect. Many are on the same sites, same different groups of people looking for projects. But I think what's important here is the number of pre-applications, because pre-apps are the indicator of the velocity of your process, the number of things that are being considered. And our numbers of pre-apps have increased dramatically, which means that we've got a very robust market out there of people trying to find projects to do and really looking through it. So I think the takeaway is, no, you can't count on all of them coming together. That number we showed that has them in is a theoretical number, but it does represent that folks are actively pursuing the market as hot right now, and the system is coming through with a number of units to meet demand.
Yeah.
April.
Yeah, it was a great honor, and I learned so much from being on that boundary committee to start looking at the way that we plan very differently. And it was a little bit prior to that when we were looking at the comprehensive plan and asking that, well, if people really value this for our children, if we know that living in and among and around and studying with children of a variety of backgrounds is so rich and important, well, there's a little bit of disconnect there, and then how we believe we live our lives and where we want to live, who we want to be surrounded by, and those are competing. And I think we have to do a better job of figuring out how we limit that segregation of ourselves. And then, for me, it's an opportunity for our neighborhoods to come together. We know we love schools. We know we love children here. We know we value education, but it would be very interesting for the community to start really looking at these issues and then trying to think, oh my goodness, like if I really believe that's important for my children at school, do I believe that that's important in the neighborhood that I live in, and even on the street that I live in, that I would be having those same kind of engagements. So, it's always been this like real pull, zoning, all of that, but I just believe that this community, especially with our comprehensive plan and trying to look at more ways, even just on the ground, if somebody's going to have one development, how do they make integrated housing models within that? So we have, or not maybe housing models, but balance as far as social economic, who gets to, so they could all live in the same unit or at least on the same road, my goodness. And I think Bellingham is capable. I think this community is capable enough to look at what we've done and decide this it's broken. We keep redoing it every 17 years, and I don't want to keep redoing it. So as we look at development, how are we going to ensure that we're building for sustainability as far as that social piece, which is also affecting the environmental piece and so many others. I also think one of the things, so that people can understand as well, there's a lot of research around children and having integrated social economic class within and a balance of it. Actually, if you break that apart and you go into a school where you've got a lot of really low income kids and a lot of really high income kids, the projection is you'll have higher dropouts, especially in males. And so it's very interesting that when you have that, which we have at some schools, it actually creates an imbalance, and we can project what's going to happen with children. On the opposite side, it's, I think, why we came up with things like source income, doing different subsidized models, is when we started that, there's a really interesting article and actually research around when you took a child out of poverty and you put them into a more affluent. It didn't have to be super affluent, but the child would actually, they could predict, would make 30% more in income just by being in that more balanced situation. So with all of that, as we tackle these things, and I think it's where it keeps coming back to, you could build all the way out to wherever, and if we don't think about the sustainability model, we'll always be grappling with these financial insecurity, or what do you call that discrepancy of finance, because we're just setting people up to make less and we're setting people up to make more, and we're not really mingling with each other, even though we think it's really important for our kids. And yeah, I think at the end of that, my last will be, I said in one of our meetings, I'd be remiss as your council member to not point out the fact that you're saying this is so important for your children. But each and every one of you, almost everybody in there, it would be interesting to see where you live and what you value, and when development comes your way, how do you respond to it? So it was really great, and I think we ended up undergoing so much more than just a boundary conversation, and we have to come back and have that. But to have that group say the number one thing we want to do is that, I think we are going to have to partner to figure out how we make that successful for you. Especially as you're willing to grow some bigger neighborhood schools. So,
Dan, you had a question?
Yeah, so I'm just trying to get this straight in my thinking. So to achieve your goals of diversity within the schools, there are two primary drivers. One is boundary adjustments, and then the other one would be housing types in neighborhoods, a variety of housing types to accommodate a range of incomes. And that, to the mayor's point, that could be a type of housing that would work for a senior, that would free up another type of housing that would work for a family. So it's not, so the smaller housing type may not work for the family, but it might work for someone who's older and wants to just not want to maintain their property as much. Are there any other drivers that we need to be considering when we're talking about achieving this diversity goal? And I guess that might be a Rick or Chris or maybe Steve, I don't know, question.
Not all at once, guys.
Or you can get back to us.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure that because
It's a good
we're not
question.
missing anything. I mean, your point before was, let's work together. That's what I heard on this. And so if there are things that we can be doing to help achieve those goals for families, then I just would want to understand what it is. So we have all the information on the table so we can make some decisions.
And maybe this doesn't answer, but one of the things I think would be important that we've tried to do, and I'm sure you do as well, is to work with our families to help them understand the value of it. I think about Via Santa Fe. We had summer school there this summer. Some of the most amazing families and kids you'll ever meet live in that complex, right? I wish you would have asked us where you should build it. Because if we could have built that, somewhere in the Columbia neighborhood, for example, oh my gosh, that would have been that. So I think, but for people in neighborhoods to understand what that does for a neighborhood, what that does for the kids in that neighborhood. I think we think about the benefit that it provides to a low-income family or a migrant family, for sure. That's a benefit to those kids. But I think sometimes we miss the other side, which is the neighborhood understanding what they gain by increasing the diversity in their area. So I think for us, it's always been, we do this with funding all the time. When we're trying to provide an equity situation in our schools of school supplies or cutting down fees or athletic costs or all that, we're trying to not take that money from families, but as money comes in, we increase the opportunity. So it's not a take from one and give to the other. It is as things happen, we create better opportunities as resources come in. When you think about new complexes going in, it wouldn't be taking away from a neighborhood, it would be adding to that neighborhood. So it doesn't feel like the neighborhood's losing because we're going to bus kids from here to there. What we're actually doing is creating more room in a school so that more diversity can come up inside of that school. So nobody leaves the school, but what comes in is more richness and diversity. So helping schools and families understand the value of that, I think, is important. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's a piece that sometimes we miss, is helping people understand the why and the importance of it rather than just making it happen, right? Which I think you can make it happen, but doesn't mean everybody will embrace it.
Mayor, you had some?
Well, I think Steve came up with an idea that we hadn't been mentioned before. When we're looking at things like the housing unit that we built there and it's subsidized by the housing levy or home fund, maybe we could be a little more strategic in working with the developer this time, Capital Community Services, wasn't it, who built that?
Yeah.
I don't remember.
Yeah.
But anyway, we could maybe work to see if we're looking at that big picture when it happens. I had someone from the Birchwood neighborhood concerned about the fact that they didn't have a big enough play area. So, you know, and I'm thinking, well, I don't know how big a play area that we require, you know, for so much. But of course, that would be an issue if you have a lot of kids in a neighborhood. But I think that's a great. That I wouldn't have thought of that. We were thinking we're just so happy there was housing available,
for sure.
rather than could we have invested a little bit more and seen if there was a better location that contributed to the whole community rather than just get it built so people have a place to live.
Okay, and then we're going to go
Yeah.
to, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just trying to think of where to go next steps in this meeting, since we'll need to organize for next time. But I certainly, one of the things we also talked in that group is that there's areas where we've just stopped building in Bellingham. It's full, that's the housing type that's allowed, and therefore it's really easy to project where that's going to go. And I think it would be extremely helpful to have some of those areas where we've said, this is what you can build, and it's pretty much built out within reason. There's no other housing types available, and then project what the cost of those housings are going to be, because that's going to be a huge impact on our schools in the long run. So I'm thinking like around the Columbia School. That's a single family mostly. There are some duplexes, apartments that were there prior to us annexing it. So right now, what you build is a single family detached home. That's what you build, and potentially an attached ADU. So, you know, for a long time, that was a very working class neighborhood, and therefore we really protected it and made sure that it stayed that way. But now it's, I mean, we just had one home get torn down and another one go up, and it sold for $730,000. I mean, right there close to the school. So I think what would be really helpful is knowing these areas that now have, that are a little bit, they're stopped, and we've specifically done that over time to protect them. Are we protecting what we think we're still protecting, I think, is what I'd like to see. And then what will that impact be on that school? I mean, that school's in the center of single family only, that one single family type. How will that be impacting that school as well? That's also an opportunity. That school has land. That's an opportunity to build, but you don't want to potentially be busing kids from, 20 minutes away whenever you have an opportunity, and you got 7 parks within a mile. So that for me would be really helpful, understanding those future impacts of those areas. And then maybe we could be more strategic as we look down the line and trying to look at the infill toolkit, how we might be able to balance housing types and keep
Okay.
it a working class neighborhood.
Okay, I think we'll open up to public comment. Is there anybody in the audience that'd like to come up and say a few words? Come on, Dick. 2 minutes, sir.
Hard for me to keep my mouth shut, as you know. Yeah, I'd like to just talk about that fine line that April was talking about of those housing types, the cottage homes and whatnot. I think we have to be careful that we aren't creating gifts for investors. that we have these housing types that are low enough in cost that families can move in there, and then they want to move up. That's what the American dream is. And the next step is the investors move in. And then your affordable housing is out the window. It turns into a rental, and it's Katie bar the door. Just a short comment, under 2 minutes.
Thank you, sir. Anybody else? Mayor,
If there's no-
come on down, sir.
Yeah. Maybe on their way. I guess my comment is, Dick, listen, I actually agree with Dick. Because that's what I thought would happen when we built the student housing.
Get closer to the microphone so they can hear you. There you go.
I'm incognito.
Yes. Go.
That's what I was hoping would happen when we built the student housing, is neighborhoods like York that had a lot of student rentals, that those would be freed up for single family. And so I don't know how you change that. But I'd be willing to think about it.
Lauren. Go ahead, sir.
I fully support the idea of diversity.
Could you give us
both-
your name for the record, sir?
Paul Moore,
Palmer.
both ethnically as well as financially. By circumstance, the elementary and high school that I went to, there was a large diversity in both categories, predominantly Hispanic. The elementary school was 50% Hispanic, 30% Anglo-American, 20% other. The high school was 70% Hispanic, the other 30% other. But the economic diversity was across the board, and what we noticed was only those at the really bottom end of the financial spectrum wound up with criminal records. Everyone else just seemed to kind of work together, and also having the diversity of the Hispanic and some African American and some Asian American. To this day, if someone asks me about my race and ethnicity, I tell them my blood is white, my ethnicity is Hispanic. And so I fully support the idea of diversity in that respect.
Thank you, sir. Anybody else? Okay, thank you, Steve. I really want to thank you for coming. You know, this housing issue has many titles to it, has many opinions, but having the school district come and tell us your story is really fascinating, and it's really something we have to get our arms around here at the city and see what we can do to help it, because when you build homes, when you build units, people go there, kids go to school, and it's a big problem. And I really applaud you for coming and telling the story, and hopefully we can have back and forth either with the school board or the administration or whatever it takes to help with this, because it, like I said, it has many facets. But this was a great hour well spent. So I want to thank everybody for coming. There is nothing else. Meeting adjourned.